So first of all, thank you all of you for participating for the fifth journal club sessions. So talking about today's speaker, the speaker today is a new academic staff member of our department. She is Dr. Himali Ratnayaka, a senior lecturer of the Department of Zoology and Environment Sciences. So she has obtained her PhD recently from University of Melbourne in 2019, and her work was based on understanding how extreme heat events affect the heat budget of Australian flying foxes with respect to their role of morphology, physiology, and behavior. So she will be presenting one of her own article today titled Forecasting Wildlife Die-Offs from Extreme Heat Events. So I would like to invite Dr. Himali to start the presentation. Over to you, Himali.
Thank you, Maheshi. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Maheshi and Professor Preeti for extending this invitation for me to present my work at the Journal Club. And it's actually great to be back at my alma mater, and I'm very happy to present this paper and to discuss about this with you all. So first of all, let me acknowledge my co-authors, Professor Michael Carney, who was my PhD principal supervisor, Dr. Pallavi Govekar, Professor David Caroli, and Associate Professor Justin Welbergen. So I hope everyone has been able to read the paper. So the paper title, as Mahesh said, Forecasting Wildlife Die-Offs from Extreme Heat Events. So before heading into the presentation, I feel I must also just mention what my PhD thesis was, because I will be touching a bit about the whole PhD thesis as well while I'm talking about this particular paper. So the title of my thesis was Understanding How Extreme Heat Events Affect the Heat Budget of Australian Flying Foxes, and particularly looking into the roles of physiology, morphology, and behavior. And my supervisors were Professor Michael Carney, Professor Justin Welbergen, Dr. Christopher Turnbull, and Professor Rodney Vanderie. So global climate models predict that with time, in recent years, there has been an increase in the mean temperature and the increase in the variance of temperature. So because of this, it has led to more hot extremes in the weather, and this is due to climate change. So in Australia particularly, we can see that this is already happening. These extreme heat waves are happening. For example, a couple of years ago, Australia had to actually add a new color to the temperature scale because it was getting so hot. And they normally have, Australia normally has a heat wave service, and they had to launch it early compared to other years because it's been getting hotter faster. So this has become a very big threat to not only animals, but humans as well. So what are the impacts of these extreme heat waves? So for humans, if we think about ourselves, it can cause heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So in these photos, you can see in the Australian Open, where the tennis players actually, some of them even collapsed because of the high temperatures. And animals, so for example, there have been catastrophic bird mortalities. In Western Australia, there were thousands of dead budgerigar during a severe heat wave in 2009. And sometimes it's not directly death. Sometimes it's a consequence of these heat waves. So for example, green turtles have suffered severe declines in health status and habitat quality for years because of a marine heat wave that happened and which killed some canopy forming seagrass species. So as you can see, whole ecosystems can collapse because of these extreme heat waves. Another indirect effect is the range contraction of certain species like the koala. Another animal that's been affected by these extreme heat waves are the Australian flying foxes. So to give you a bit of an introduction of Australian flying foxes, there are four species of flying foxes in mainland Australia. So one is the grey-headed flying fox, the black flying fox, the spectacled flying fox, and the little red flying fox. So these flying foxes are canopy-feeding frugivores, so they eat fruit, and nectarivores, so they eat nectar. And they roost in aggregations of various sizes on exposed branches. So as you can see in this photo, it's the grey-headed flying foxes. They don't roost in caves like some other bats. They are on trees and on exposed branches. So you can see why heat waves would affect them directly. And two of these species of flying foxes, the grey-headed and the spectacled, are listed as vulnerable nationally and globally. And the main threats that these flying foxes face are habitat loss, culling, and extreme heat events. So the death of these flying foxes have actually been on the Australian news for quite a while, quite a few years now, and it has become a very big problem, mainly because of the sheer numbers of it, and of course the human health concerns that come with dead bats just around everywhere. Another problem that management faces is the abandonment of pups. So when the adults die, they leave the pups, so the babies, abandoned. So there has to be a volunteer group that has to take care of them, and that requires a lot of resources. So to avoid a major crisis like this, a simple solution would be to predict beforehand when, where, and how flying fox heat stress events would occur. So if we can predict it beforehand, then we can be prepared and we would know how to allocate our limited resources efficiently. So in this paper, we will be looking at predicting when and where these flying fox heat stress events would occur. So that's the paper for today. And this is also the first research question in my thesis. So can we predict die-offs using forecast air temperature? So we know that with high air temperature, there are more die-offs. We've seen this empirically. So we can think of air temperature as a proxy or an indicator for die-offs. An empirical study that was done by Wellbergen and colleagues have shown that in 80% of affected colonies underwent an air temperature of 42 degrees Celsius. So because of this empirical data that we have, we can make an assumption that heat stress related die-off events occur in flying foxes when the air temperature is 42 degrees Celsius or above. So far, what's been done to protect these species is basically these wildlife managers and volunteer groups, they check the online weather report and see whether the air temperature is going to be more than 42 on a particular day. And if it is, they check an online website called the National Flying Fox Monitoring Viewer, which has all the flying fox colonies in Australia, and they check if there is any corresponding location that will undergo 42 Celsius or above. So it's a very tedious and labor-intense process that's been happening so far. So the questions we wanted to ask in this paper, we can divide into 4 categories. Number 1, how well can the forecast air temperature predict the actual air temperature of a flying fox colony? So the forecast air temperature need not be the actual air temperature. This is because of the creation of a microhabitat. So under a tree, there can be a microhabitat which causes a microclimate. So the forecast air temperature and the actual air temperature need not be the same. So we wanted to see whether the forecast air temperature can predict the actual air temperature of a flying fox colony. Number 2, does the 42-degree air temperature threshold apply for forecast air temperatures as well? So what I said before, the 42 air temperature threshold was for an empirical study. So it was measured air temperature. So we wanted to see if this 42 value can be used for forecast air temperature as well. Number 3, how well can the forecast air temperatures predict flying fox die-offs? So that's, yeah, basically that's the main thing, that whether we can actually use these forecast air temperatures to predict a die-off. And also, finally, can we automate the predictions and make it accessible to all without having to tediously look at different websites manually? So to answer these questions, we used gridded forecast air temperature data from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology for the simulations. So if I talk a bit about these forecast air temperatures, so they're from the regional domain. It's specifically called Australian Community Climate and Earth System Simulator, or ACCESS-R, numerical weather prediction system called the NWP system. This system has a region-wide resolution of about 12 kilometers. So we can know the exact air temperature of with a scale of 12 kilometers, and it gives an output 4 times a day. And we got these forecast air temperatures for every 24 hours and 48 hours in advance. So the study we used was the largest recorded flying fox heat stress event that happened in Australia in 2014 in southeast Queensland. So out of the 102 colonies that were present in this region, 52 of them were had confirmed mortality, so almost half. So the data we got were hourly in situ air temperature in one of the affected roofs in a place called Gympie. And we measured these air temperatures using a device called iButton hygrochrons that were deployed in permanent shade and 1.5 meters above ground level. So basically on top of a tree, tall tree. And in this picture, what you see here is actually a few, I would say 100 flying foxes that had died. So how well can the ACCESS-R forecast air temperature predict the actual air temperature of a flying fox colony? So like I said, forecast air temperature can vary from air temperature of a flying fox colony because of the microclimate within the camp. The accuracy of the ACCESS-R temperature forecast may especially vary with temperature extremes such as heat waves. Now, for example, we know for a fact that when it's really hot, even we or animals would go under a tree because it's shady and the air temperature is low. So the air temperature of an outdoor area or the broader landscape would be different to what's under a tree. So we calculated what's called the forecast skill, which is the relative accuracy of the forecast against a reference forecast or value. So basically, we wanted to see how accurate the forecast air temperature was against an actual air temperature. That's the ambient air temperature for a flying fox. So, so these are the two methods we used. We used in situ measured data using these iButtons. I hope you can see my mouse. And also interpolated weather station data from a system called AWAP to evaluate the skill of the ACCESS-R model forecast to predict flying fox die-offs at extreme high temperatures. So for this, we calculated a few verification scores, as you would have read in the paper. So first, we calculated what's called a root mean square error, or RMSE, which is a standard method to verify such differences, and the bias, which can be calculated, which was calculated by deducting the forecast air temperature by the observed amount. So for both of these, actually, you can see that there is, in fact, an error or a bias. So which means there is a difference in the forecast air temperature and the actual air temperature of the flying fox colony. And if you look at the correlation or the Spearman coefficient, you can see that the two air temperatures are quite correlated. So this is the same data on a plot so that it's easier to understand. So on the left-hand side, you see the data for the extreme heat event day. And on the right-hand side is for the entire summer, so 3-month period. So in both instances, the correlation is quite high. So even though there is a slight discrepancy between the modeled and measured air temperatures, there's no significant difference in the forecast's accuracy to predict the ambient air temperature during an extreme heat event. Next, we wanted to look at whether this does the 42 air temperature threshold apply for forecast air temperatures as well. So if you look at this graph, so this is for the first bit is for the 24-hour forecast, and the second bit is for the 48-hour forecast. And these are the different temperature threshold we checked. So we looked at temperature threshold of 38, 40, 42, and 44. And we looked at different scores as well. So the accuracy, is it accurate? The probability of detection, how likely is it that die-off is detected? False alarm ratio, which means how much false alarms would there be? So if there is, for example, a false alarm is when a prediction would say that there is a die-off, but actually there is no die-off. A frequency bias and a critical success index. So how successful were the predictions? So if you look at the accuracy only for the time being, you can see that if you use a 44 air temperature threshold, the accuracy is quite low compared to the other air temperature thresholds. So we can kind of forget about these two columns. Then out of the other 3 air temperature thresholds, 38 degrees Celsius has the lowest accuracy. So we can now consider only the 40 and the 42 air temperature thresholds. So if you take a look at the accuracy of these two thresholds, they're quite similar in accuracy. However, the probability of detection is better if you're using the 40 degrees Celsius. But again, when you're looking at the false alarm ratios, it's higher when you're using 40 degrees Celsius. So it's actually not that good. If you have a lot of false alarms, that means a lot of valuable resources can be wasted. So having a high false alarm ratio is not a good thing. The frequency bias, again, is higher for the 40 threshold. So again, that's not a very good sign. So perhaps using the 42 is better in this instance. If you take a look at the critical success index, how successful are your predictions if you use these two thresholds, they're pretty similar. Then I performed a logistic regression model and calculated the odds ratios. So if we take a look at the odds ratios for the 24-hour and 48-hour forecasts, you can clearly see that using, so the odds ratio gives you how basically what is the probability that your prediction is correct. So clearly the 44 using the 44 Celsius threshold has very low odds, so it's not good to use that. If you compare only the other the 38, 40, and 42 air temperature thresholds, you can see that basically, even though the 42 degrees Celsius has a lower odds of happening compared to the 38 and 40, if you take a look at the confidence intervals, the confidence interval, the upper and lower gap is quite high. That means that even though the accuracy might, or the odds might be higher for the 38 and 40, the precision is quite low if you're using a 38 and 40 degrees Celsius threshold. So the precision will be higher for the 42 air temperature threshold. So again, this kind of brings us to saying that probably the 42-degree air temperature threshold is good to make predictions. So yes, so like I said, both odds ratios indicate that there was a significant probability that flying foxes will die when the forecast air temperature is equal or greater than 42. Either forecast can be used to make informative predictions of the die-off. So both are quite good. Of course, the odds are better when it's 24-hour, when it's a 24-hour forecast, because the closer you are to the actual time of the event, the better the prediction will be. So the third question, how well can the AccessR forecast air temperature predict flying fox die-offs? So here in this graph, you can, in this table, you can see on the left-hand side, the 24-hour and 48-hour forecast, and whether the forecast air temperature was 42 above. So yes, it was 42, or no, it wasn't 42. And here, whether a death occurred or not. So here you can see that there were 77% correct predictions. And here you can see for the 48-hour forecast, there were 73% correct predictions. So basically, if a correct prediction can be defined as if the forecast air temperature was 42 or above, so yes, and a death occurred, yes. So 37 plus, if it would be a correct prediction if the forecast air temperature was not above 42, and a death didn't occur, so 42. So if you combine these two values, you will get 77% and 73%. So these are quite good predictions. Having a 77% likelihood that your prediction is correct is quite good odds. So this is just a map of the predictions and how accurate it will be. The descriptions were there in the paper. So the green dots are the hits, so are the correct positives, and the correct negatives are in blue. So all of those are correct predictions. So the other interesting thing that we did manage to do for this paper was we developed an automated system that can predict which flying fox roosts are most likely to be exposed to extreme heat events up to 72 hours in advance. So we actually created a website for this called the Flying Fox Heat Stress Forecaster, and you can access it through this link down below here. So yeah, so the aim of creating this was to assist different stakeholders who are affected and need to respond to extreme heat events. So for this, we used weather data from the Bureau of Meteorology and occupied colony data from the National Flying Fox Monitoring Program. So here, every 6 hours, we got the AccessR forecast air temperature, and it was queried in our programming environment to find flying fox roosts that were exposed to air temperatures above 38, which we considered as a heat stress threshold, and 42, which we considered a mortality. So this is a screenshot of some of the website. So you can see the map of Australia, and these black dots are all the colonies. So you can clearly say whether your roost or the roost that you need to manage is in the area or not. And this gives you the forecast date and the time. And this is basically telling you whether there are any flying fox roosts in Australia that are under stress. So when this reads high temperatures, 42 or more, are likely in flying fox areas in Southeast Australia in the next 3 days. And you can also subscribe to this and so that you can get email alerts. So like this is for a particular colony called Clermont. So as you can see, this particular colony on this day had reached above 38 and 42 at this particular time. So the website also provides a priority list according to the time at which it goes above 42 Celsius, the maximum temperature reached, and the population size. So you can prioritize where you would want to allocate your resources. So say if you have a team of 10 volunteers, if the population size of the camp, if one particular site, if you have 2 particular sites to attend to, and the population size in one camp is high, you know, okay, I need to send 70% of my group that particular camp with the higher population size. So in summary, to answer the questions, how well can the ACCESS-R forecast air temperature predict the actual air temperature of the flying fox colony? He can do it pretty well. Does the 42 air temperature threshold apply for forecast air temperatures as well? Yes. And how well can the ACCESS-R forecast air temperatures predict flying fox colonies? So as you remember, it was about 77%. So pretty well. But what accounts for the remainder? So 77%, like I said, is quite good. But what about the other 20-odd%? So if you consider an animal that's heat stressed, is it only air temperature that actually affects it? What about other environmental factors like relative humidity, wind speed, solar radiation? And there are microclimate, their foliage cover, the temperature of surrounding surfaces. And what about their morphology? How long are their fur? How deep are their fur? What shape or posture are they normally in? Their physiology, what's their normal basal metabolic rate? Animals, and of course their behavior. Do they have distinguishing behavior that they do when they're heat stressed, like salivating, panting, or wing fanning like the bat? So all of these factors contribute to the heat stress and whether they are heat stressed, and that could account for the remaining accuracy of a prediction. And on top of that, the sex, age, and the species would matter as well. So before I spoke about when and whether we can predict when and where a flying fox event could occur. And now I will just touch very briefly on how these flying fox heat stress events would occur. So this brings me to the second question of my thesis. How do fur properties affect the heat budget of flying foxes? So this chapter was actually very recent, last month. I published it. So if anyone wants to have a read, please let me know and I can send it to you. So why does fur matter for the heat budget? Basically, mainly for 2 purposes, for insulation and for solar reflectance or absorption. And there are different traits of fur that affect or influence this. So the fur depth and fur length, as well as the fur color, fur solar reflectivity, the thickness of the layer, and the thickness of, the diameter of the hairs and the fur density, all of these traits would affect the heat budget of an animal. So the questions I wanted to ask were, do fur properties of different flying fox species vary? Do fur properties of different ages, sexes, and body parts vary? Can differences in fur properties of these groups explain discrepancy in mortality rates during extreme heat events? Because from observations, we know that particular species, especially the black flying fox, and also females and young tend to die more than their counterparts. So for this, I measured the fur length, fur depth, and fur solar reflectance using museum specimens. I got the values for each of these in different body parts. So I won't go into detail about all of this because today we are here to talk about basically only the forecast air temperature, but I'll just give you a brief summary of the results only. Do fur properties of different flying fox species vary? Yes, they do. Do fur properties of different ages, sexes, and body parts vary? Sometimes it depends on the it depends on the fur property that we're talking about. And can potential differences in fur properties of these groups explain discrepancy in mortality rates? To an extent, yes. So it's very important to understand how these different morphological factors come into play when we're thinking about heat stress. And especially when we want to conserve a particular species, we need to know how different species are adapted and can adapt to these different situations. So the third question that I wanted to ask was, what happens to the physiology and behavior of a flying fox when they're heat stressed? So basically, when it becomes very hot, a bat would normally start to fan its wings. And if it continues to get hot, the bat will seek shade under a tree or a bush. But if it still continues to get hot, like it does in Australia, they will start to lick their wings and their face and the rest of their body. And also they would start panting, which we normally observe even in dogs when it's really hot. So because of these two, because of licking and panting, there will be water loss. And on top of that, there will be a body temperature increase and also a metabolic rate increase. So it's important to understand how these physiological and behavioral thermoregulatory processes happen so that we can implement effective management strategies. So the question I wanted to ask was basically, do natural variation in relative humidity experienced by flying foxes during extreme heat events have an impact on their body temperature, metabolic rate, water loss, and behavior? So to do that, I created an experimental protocol where I get flying foxes from the wild and keep them in chambers that can change the air temperature or the ambient temperature that they're faced with. And also I had two humidity regimes where I would have low humidity and then also high humidity. I'm very briefly explaining all of this because there's a lot of detail in here. So if you have more questions, please free to ask me after this. I'd be very happy to. Yeah, so for each condition, they were exposed for 30 minutes each. So how were these bats caught? Using very tall mist nets. And we caught them when they were coming back from their feed at around 4 o'clock in the morning. So the capture site was a place called Emu Plains in New South Wales. And we did respirometry experiments on a total of 17 grey-headed flying foxes. So this is what the experimental setup kind of looked like. Basically, there was a big incubator where we can control the ambient temperature. And inside the incubator, there was a small chamber where the bat was. And inside the chamber, you can control the temperature and the humidity. And we can measure their oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor pressure, and their body temperature. So this is what it actually looked like in real life. So a quick summary of the results. So basically, the body temperature did not vary in the different relative humidities. However, the metabolic rate did change. So they were getting very tense and worked up while the humidity altered. And there were changes in water loss that were observed and also behavior. So the reason why I say I spoke about those two research questions was to come to this final research question. Can we better predict die-offs using a biophysical model? So first we spoke about the air temperature, but now we're talking about the biophysical model. So like I said, all of these factors, not only air temperature, would come into play when we're trying to calculate how a flying fox would actually get heat stress. So when we're looking at a biophysical model, basically in a biophysical model, what happens is we look at how an animal's heat fluxes happen. So that depends on the heat budget equation that's down here below. So basically, the basic theory behind it is the heat gained by an animal would equal the heat lost and whatever heat is stored within the animal. So to calculate these different quantities in the heat budget, we need different sets of data. So we need weather and microclimate data and data of the animal, different characteristics and traits. So the biophysical model that I use is called NicheMapper or NicheMapR, which is the version that's available on R in the R programming language. And there are two sub-models for this, the microclimate model and the animal model. So by using these two sub-models, we can make more accurate predictions. We can identify driving forces of heat stress, and we can also identify what are the more vulnerable groups, which species, which sexes, and which age groups are more vulnerable to heat stress. So very quickly, if we just compare the results. So the first of these first two columns are the forecast air temperature models, and the final column here is the predictions from the biophysical model. As you can see, the accuracy is higher when we use the biophysical model. So this is where we use all the other factors, including air temperature. Here, it is just the air temperature that we've used to make predictions. So the accuracy is higher. Next, the probability of detection is similar, I would say, in all three models. However, the false alarm ratio is much lower in the biophysical model, which is a major positive thing. Also, the frequency bias is, I mean, it's a bit less, not very much less, but it's a bit less. And the critical success index, which shows how successful your prediction is going to be, is much higher in a biophysical model. So all in all, you can clearly see that using a biophysical model would give you better, accurate predictions. So as conclusions and to talk about a bit of the potential of these biophysical models, yes, effective predictions of heat stress in bats can be made directly from empirical approaches, but they are less robust, especially because if we're using empirical approaches, we need lots and lots of data to have accurate predictions. Whereas mechanistic approaches allow us to predict heat stress under any hypothetical condition, because you just input what kind of situation you think the bat would face, and it would give the output of, okay, this is how it's going to behave or react. We can also inform management about more important environmental and animal conditions that we need to consider. And these modeling approaches can be transferred easily to other taxa, as long as we have the relevant data that's required for the input of the model. Any taxa, we can make these predictions. Can make specific predictions of heat stress for vulnerable groups. So yeah, so that's basically it for my presentation. I'd like to just acknowledge some of the people that helped with the paper, as well as my thesis. So my supervisors that I mentioned before, my PhD committee members. These were my funding bodies for the paper, as well as some of the research that I did in my thesis. Expert advice, I'd like to especially mention Dr. Anurika De Silva, who helped a lot with my statistics. And these were some of the organizations that provided data. And of course, numerous field assistants I had in Sydney and Melbourne. Thank you.
Thank you, Himali, for that very interesting talk. And I think in the absence of Professor Yapa, it's really good to have a bat woman in the department. I have another meeting, so I'll just ask one or two questions. First is that, are these mixed colonies?
Some are, madam. So for example, where I did my field work, it had gray-headed flying foxes and black flying foxes. It depends. Some are only one species, some have multiple. So far in Australia, there's only one colony that has all 4 species, and that's also very rare.
Right. So as you rightly pointed out later on, that the species specific inherent trait might change their vulnerability.
Yes.
Yeah. So second thing I wanted to ask is 42. Is that the maximum?
No, that is not the maximum, madam. That is where basically the reason why 42 became so popular is because they found that 80% of the colonies that had mortalities had undergone 42 degrees at the minimum. So it can be 42 or above.
Okay.
Less than 42, the chances of them dying is less.
Right. So 42, the duration doesn't matter really, is it? Or?
Duration does matter, madam, but we unfortunately don't have the data to back that up. We don't know like how long, how many days. There is some research happening now to make those calculations. But yes, the duration will definitely matter. Like, I mean, from personal experience, I know if it's just 1 day of 40, the bats are kind of okay. They can recover overnight because then a cool change comes the next day.
Right.
But if it's 42 for 3 days, the numbers that die are much higher.
Okay, 2 small questions before I run off. One is how, I will ask them back to back. One is whether you think that the microchiropterans who use a much more secluded environment like a cave or a tree hole or culvert, for example, would be affected less by this, and also whether there are any other vulnerability factors like a disease in a particular area, because the colonies that you were considering or in this program of yours is the distribution is fairly vast. So either I don't know any other factor other than the species specific traits and what you said, the habitat factors, any other like a disease, some population vulnerability?
Yes, so I'll first answer that question. I think lactation, whether they are lactating or not, is a big factor.
Okay.
One thing is, normally these heat waves happen. It used to happen in around January, February, when the females were not lactating. By that time, the pups were a bit older. But now, with heat waves happening earlier in the year because of climate change, some of these extreme heat waves are happening around November, when it's like the prime time for lactation. So now that has become a very big problem that we scientists are struggling to resolve. So that's one thing. Other than that, disease as such, I am not really familiar with a problem like that. Sorry, madam, what was the previous question?
Chiropterans who use
Yes, yeah. So yes, madam, I think, I mean, it makes sense that microchiropterans who normally are in caves or tree hollows or something like that, which are generally cooler, won't be as affected, because like I said, these flying foxes roost on open branches, so they would get direct solar radiation. Of course, they do go to the shade when it's hot, but the problem is there isn't enough shaded areas. So what we find is, normally if like the bats that first go into the shade are normally better protected. But there's another thing that happens where they all clump up together in the shade, and that just causes another problem because they're all hot inside. So the ones that are inside are very hot, and all of them kind of die like a ball. It's a very disturbing sight, actually. But yeah, so I feel that microchiropterans probably have a better time during these heat waves than these flying foxes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, madam.
Himali, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. So I think it's a very timely study as well, because heat waves are quite a big thing in Australia.
Yes.
Probably you know that even Charuni, one of my former students, she's studying
Yes,
heat
ma'am.
waves.
Yes.
Yes, and so it has not only affected the land animals, but also the marine environment. Marine heat waves, they are also pretty big, right?
Yes, madam. That's why what I showed you in the, I think the one of the first few slides, where the marine heat waves killed almost 90% of a canopy covering seaweed. So we don't
Yes.
think too much about seaweeds, but they're very important for other animals that are in the seas as well.
Yeah,
So even
and
coral bleaching is happening because of these heat waves. So it's
exactly. I think more than half of the Great Barrier Reef is dead because of heat waves, right?
Yes, madam. Yeah. So I actually went snorkeling, and it was all white, and yeah, it was not a nice sight to see.
Course. So your study is very important. And I would like to ask now, you said that your models can be used for other taxa, right?
Yes,
so have these models been tested and validated against the observations of any other organisms?
Yes, madam. So I didn't go into detail about that, but before using these models for the flying fox, I obviously validated against measured data. So other than for the flying fox, I know it has been validated for many insects, and koalas, and cats.
Okay.
And yeah, several others. Those are the things that are coming into my mind now. But yeah, if you actually go to that niche mapper website, you should be able to see, madam.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Himali.
Right. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Himali. So I have a small question, like the method that you have used and the approaches that you have taken. So whether there is a possibility of applying those approaches in Sri Lankan condition, and if so, like what kind of limitations that like we can encounter? That's the case.
Yes. very good question. Actually, the good thing about using models is the fact that, well, one thing is it's on R, which is open source, so you don't need a license for it. So it's freely accessible, so anyone in Sri Lanka can use it. Getting the data will be the issue. So I mean, it's not very difficult data to get, but you need things like the basal metabolic rates of the animal, the skin temperature of the animal. So these are things that can be measured in the lab. So it's not very high-tech things. So I feel like there's definitely scope for this to be done in like for Sri Lankan animals as well.
Okay, thank you, Himali.
Himali, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have a question, but not related to your research. I'm just asking this out of curiosity. So
Yeah.
once they get to know that these or a particular set of bats are at risk, what are they doing?
Yeah. So
Australia.
yeah, good question. So what they do is actually, so there are lots of stakeholders involved. I actually had a slide for this, but I removed it because I thought I'll take up too much time. So basically there's the government officials, so like the equivalent of the wildlife department and the forestry departments, who are in charge of the forest area and the animals. And other than that, there are these people called bat carers. So they are voluntary people. So they are voluntary groups. They love bats. So they are like kind of like you can think of them like animal rights activists, but for bats.
Okay.
They take care of bats. So they go there, they get the injured animals and they take them to their facilities. They give them water and food and take care of them. So it's a network of organizations, volunteers. So they actually come in along with the government officials. So the government officials come and check out the area, make sure that the volunteers are doing it properly, because they have to wear gloves, they have to be vaccinated against Lissa virus, which is kind of like rabies equivalent. So the officials check that everything is in order, and these volunteer groups are the people that are actually doing the jobs.
Okay. So is there something like a risk category, like high risk, low risk? When do they start doing all this? Or
So what we told is, so when the temperatures is predicted to be around 38 on the day, people get ready. So yeah, but when it's 42, they start going in to the camps, because you don't want to disturb. So when humans go into these colonies, then the animals
they
get
disturbed,
disturbed.
yes.
And then then their internal temperatures increase even more. So that's
Yes, because of
another
stress
problem.
and everything. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
you have to wait until they really can't do anything, then these volunteers go in.
Okay, thank you, Himali.
No.
Himali, that was a very nice presentation.
Thank
And
you,
I'm really glad that we have a physiologist, a trained physiologist back with us, because Professor Ratna Suri was there. He was, as you can remember, was into reproductive physiology in a big way.
Yes.
So likewise, what are your plans for the future?
Yes, madam. So I hope to set up something similar to this. Even though I have done my undergraduate research as well as my PhD on bats, I'm not only a bat woman. I'm open to work with other taxa as well, but physiology is something that I'm really interested in, and there's so much scope in Sri Lanka. So I would like to continue something like this to see, because heat waves and climate change is not something that's happening only in Australia, it's happening here in Sri Lanka as well. So I see a lot of potential, and like I said, especially with the modeling aspect, it's very easy because it can be done even during these COVID times at home. So yes, there's a lot of things to be done, madam, and I'm excited to start.
All the best, Himali.
Thank you, madam.
Dr. Himali, I am Ashoka, a PhD student. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. I have two questions.
Yes.
In your experiment, do you found that whether the body temperature of the bats go below the environmental temperature so that they have more, like during the hot times, they can store more heat like animals in desert areas like camels do?
Yeah, actually, no, that does not happen for these flying foxes. What I observed is they maintain their body temperature at the same. So anyway, their body temperature at the start is above the air temperature. And when I increase the air temperature, they maintain their body temperature. But after a particular point, their air temperature increases, and then we stopped the experiment because that's very dangerous. We didn't want any of the bats to die. So they don't drop their body temperature. But I know a few, even microbats, they do that dropping of temperature to conserve their energy. But yes.
Yeah, that's right. Very interesting. And would there be any possibility that like provide artificial shade for these colonies that affected badly regularly?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that I've been pushing for as well. But there are lots of practical issues for that because these colonies are massive. So they sometimes go on for about 500 meters. So they're very, very large colonies, and sometimes they're dispersed on two sides of the river. So, so there are a lot of practical issues for that. But theoretically, if they had artificial shade and if they were okay with going into this artificial shade, because they're wild animals, we can't force them to go into this shade. So they need to be okay with going into it. Definitely, the heat stress would reduce. It's just the practical issues that are involved in it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Maybe I'm thinking like we don't need to cover just the colony. Maybe like something to cover the radiation that come in particular site, something like that from a distance. Or that's just came to my mind.
Yeah. There are what people are doing now is they're trying to regenerate some shrubs, so that at least there's more areas for them to go to natural shade without artificial shade. I think in one, because there are many colonies in Australia, one government, this thing they had actually tried to create an artificial shade, but the bats have not gone into that area. So I think there's a bit of a problem where they don't like to go to an artificial area. But yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Himali, for that very interesting talk, and also like describing all these technologies that you have used in your study, which I think will definitely help our younger scientists as well in our department. So I wish you all the very best in your academic career. And also I would like to thank the audience as well for their interactive engagement with the speaker. So we'll meet again in the next Journal Club session, and thank you all for participating. Have a nice day.